Welcome to Channel 24, everyone. We're joined by David Tafuri, a foreign policy analyst and a lawyer. He has closely followed the war in Ukraine, America's role in NATO, and the challenges posed by Russia, China, and other authoritarian states. And with him today, we will examine the latest developments in the U.S. policy, the Pentagon's decisions, and what they mean for the world, for Ukraine. So, David, it's a pleasure to see you in our studios today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, David, for the first time, almost in 7 years, the U.S. federal government has entered a shutdown as Republicans and Democrats failed to agree on a new budget. Could you please elaborate more on this? What are the risks for the United States at first?
Sure. So what happened is that there's a disagreement in Congress between the Republicans, who are the majority party, and the Democrats. The specific disagreement relates to the ending of certain healthcare benefits that would end as a result of the appropriations bill recently passed by Congress. And Democrats do not want those benefits to end, and they believe that for them to end would cause significant hardship, especially for people who depend upon subsidies for their health care. As a result of this disagreement, the Republicans, who need some Democrats to vote with them to pass a spending measure, are not able to pass that spending measure. The spending measure is necessary to fund the federal government, and without it, the federal government has to close down certain departments and agencies.
So for how long it could last, this process?
In the past, the time you mentioned in 2019, I believe it lasted about 5 weeks. So it could last indefinitely, although it creates more pressure on both parties to try to find a compromise, because people across the country will be unhappy, especially as they lose services from the federal government. And so that ultimately should result in there being a compromise that passes a spending measure and reopens the federal government.
Well, but why is so complicated, this shutdown? It's always happening under Trump's presidency, isn't it?
Well, it's also happened in Obama's presidency as well. The Freedom Caucus, which is conservative Republicans, forced a government shutdown in President Obama's presidency as well. It did happen in Trump's presidency. It's something that didn't used to happen, 30, 50, 100 years ago. It's, I think, a new phenomenon, and it's essentially a representation of the breakdown of cooperation between the two parties in Congress.
Yes, and just a last question on this one topic. Could this somehow affect U.S. policy towards Ukraine?
I think in terms of the short term, it shouldn't have too much impact for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Trump administration has not been trying to push through particular funding for Ukraine. So there's no new funding coming from the U.S. government. And so the Ukraine is not going to be deprived of that funding as a result of this shutdown. Also, the parts of the U.S. government that are essential for security and national security, those normally continue to operate even during a government shutdown. Maybe some of the people who are in those jobs do not get paid, but they are still directed to go to work. And because of their commitment, they will still go to work. And so the State Department, the National Security Council, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Pentagon, those people will be deemed essential, and they'll continue to work. And those are probably the agencies that are most important for Ukraine and cooperation between the government of Ukraine and the federal government in the United States.
David, just recently, American President Donald Trump gathered together 800 generals in person at Quantico. It looked almost like a press show, not a briefing with the generals. And Pete Hegseth spoke about fat generals, criticized them somehow, and promised new rules on discipline and fitness. So, but what was the real decisions came out of this meeting, and what is, I mean, from your perspective, was that more about the show or something about serious issues?
I think there definitely were some theatrics to it. I think Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has some pretty different visions for the Pentagon than his predecessors, and he wanted that to make that clear to all of the generals and admirals. I think it was also intended to show, strength by the leadership at the Pentagon, to remind the generals that they take orders from the commander in chief, which is President Trump, and through Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. So it was also intended, I think, to rein in any generals or admirals who might not be completely responsive or taking direction. But I don't think that's actually an issue right now. There are no instances that of which we are aware where generals or admirals have not been accepting orders from the Secretary of Defense. So hopefully things will continue more or less as they did before, but with some augmentation in terms of the conduct and behavior of the generals and the admirals, perhaps more responsiveness by them, and I guess more dedication to personal fitness.
Yeah, I think that the Politico magazine said Trump could send an email instead of gathering all together. So it's just, but, from your perspective, was that kind of a meeting unusual when such a lot of generals gathering together in one place?
Well, I've heard from people in the U.S. military that it was unusual. It's never been done like that before. There was a lot of intrigue around it when it was announced that this was going to happen. No one understood exactly what the purpose was. And I think there's still some question marks around why it was done and what it was intended to do, and will it happen again. But I do think people are just moving on from this and going back to their responsibilities.
Yes, David, and a few more. President Trump is always doing his very strong statements regarding Russia, regarding Ukraine lately, and sometimes Ukrainians see at this quite, it's surprising Ukrainians. So my question to you: recently he knocked Russian dictator Putin for not doing any success in the war in Ukraine for almost 4 years. Do you think it's something personal between Trump and Putin, or it's a serious political shift in his behavior?
I think it's an evolution of President Trump's understanding and view of the Ukraine war. And I think it stems from the fact that he made a lot of statements during the campaign before he had been fully briefed and had a full and complete understanding of the causes of the war in Ukraine. And I think it's also the result of frustration by President Trump, who had more confidence in Putin than almost anyone around the world. He believed, I think, that Putin wanted peace, even though most keen observers did not believe that Putin wants peace. And there's abundant evidence that Putin wasn't really serious about having a peace deal. But I think Trump has now recognized that. And so he's both trying to put in place some measures to coerce Putin to perhaps go to the bargaining table in good faith, and to put out there the potential threats of what could happen if Putin does not do that. And so that's what's happening right now. But I also would caution everyone to recognize that President Trump often changes his mind. So right now he seems very positive about President Zelensky and Ukraine, and that's based on recent meetings and conversations. But it could change, of course, and we have to be ready for that.
Oh, yes, David, we always keeping that in mind. So, yeah, and just regarding Trump's evolution in his vision of a Russian war in Ukraine, President Zelensky, he was dictator, now he's not a dictator. So just a question regarding his recent decision that he now authorized Ukraine to strike deep into Russia and the decision of supplying Tomahawk. We don't see that, right? This is uncertain so far, but how do you evaluate these moves of the American president?
Well, I think this has happened for a couple of reasons. First of all, Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces have very adeptly demonstrated how striking further into Russia, at striking at headquarters of the military and warehouses where there are weapons and equipment, and hitting their supply chain and hitting their oil facilities, is actually having an impact in a positive way for Ukraine and positive way for Europe. And so it's changing the nature of the war, and it's giving Ukraine more leverage. And so I think the Trump administration, watching that and getting intelligence reports about it, say, okay, well, maybe we should help them do even more of this, because that could be a game changer. So the consideration of providing Tomahawks, which can go as 5 to 10 times as far into Russia as the other weapons we've given so far, is intended to provide Ukraine with the strategic and military capacity to hit Russia even harder where it really hurts for Russia. As President Zelensky said, though, if Ukraine gets Tomahawk missiles, they may not even use them. Just having them is a threat to Russia that could help move things forward with a potential ceasefire.
Yeah, absolutely true. And speaking about the possibility of the United States to persuade all European countries to stop buying Russian oil, we see some countries like Slovakia, Hungary, of course, they do not want to do that. Do you think that United States somehow is capable to persuade them to do that?
Well, if anyone is capable, you would think it would be President Trump, because he has a good relationship with the leaders of those two countries, Hungary and Slovakia. They are more right-wing leaders who have a little bit more affinity for Russia than the rest of the European leaders. And so they have, some things in common with President Trump as well. And so that's probably why he's targeted that as a basis. But I think critics might say, okay, is he just using that as an excuse? He says he wants to do sanctions, but then he's coming up with an excuse not to do new sanctions, saying first Europe has to give up on buying all oil from Russia. But President Trump is right. No country in Europe should be buying oil from Russia. But at the same time, the reality is, since the invasion in February 2022, many countries in Europe that were buying oil and gas from Russia have ceased to do so. It's only these two outliers, Hungary and Slovakia.
Absolutely true, David. I recently opened the data, and what country was the leader of buying Russian gas in June? It was Belgium. So it just, it's I can relate on that, and I can agree that it's kind of unfair, basically. So, and I was just reading the statement from Estonian president, and he believed that Donald Trump is tired of endless talks with dictator Putin. Do you see that in this way?
I think President Trump is frustrated. Remember, he made a campaign promise that he would end the Ukraine war, and he would do it in a day. Now, I think everyone recognized it wasn't going to be able to be done in a day, but I think he feels frustrated 9 months into his administration that no progress has been made on a ceasefire, and it reveals what a lot of close watchers understood, which is Putin doesn't want a ceasefire right now. He doesn't want peace. He still has objectives he intends to try to accomplish in Ukraine, and until he's met with even further force and more sanctions and more hardship to his economy, he's likely not going to bend and make the compromises necessary for there to be a ceasefire that would meet the aspirations of the Ukrainian people.
And David, the last one, actually speaking about the personal meeting of Ukrainian president and Russian dictator Putin, do you think it's possible with the involvement of American president, and do you think it's really necessary?
For Zelensky and Putin to deal with each other directly?
Yes.
I mean, I think to actually have a real ceasefire, that would actually hold and that Russia would not violate, it is going to require some diplomacy directly between Ukraine and Russia, because only the leaders of Ukraine and Russia actually understand what is necessary for there to be a ceasefire and for the ceasefire to hold. I do think President Trump would likely be the person in the room with them. He is in a good place to try to push together the two leaders from Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine obviously is a very close ally of the United States, and Russia not a close ally of the United States, but there's a friendship between Trump and Putin that he could try to utilize in order to accomplish a ceasefire.
David, thank you so much for being with me today. It was a great pleasure speaking with you, and I hope it's not going to be our last time speaking together.
Me too. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!